Thank you everyone for being here this afternoon. This is day 4 of the 31st Woods Hole Film Festival. My name is Judy Laster, and I wanted to just say a couple of words. How many, if you've never been to the festival before, raise your hand. Wow. Well, have you been to anything, or is this your first screening ever? First thing ever? Okay. So the Woods Hole Film Festival is an 8-day event that takes place each year from the last Saturday of July through the first Saturday of August. Over the 8 days, we screen films that we select from submissions that we receive from around the world. This year, we have 116 films screening over the 8 days, and our screening venues are Redfield Auditorium, which is part of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, Clapp Auditorium, which is part of the Marine Biological Laboratory, Falmouth Academy, and Cotuit Center for the Arts. If you have a program, take a look at it. We have such incredible films. They're also screening virtually if you don't have a chance to see them in person. The virtual component of the festival lasts through Saturday. So don't do anything else for the rest of the week. Just watch films, preferably come to them in person, because we're so fortunate that we have many filmmakers who have come here from all over to be here, in no small part because of Woods Hole. The community is a very big part of this festival. It takes a lot of people to make it happen. We work year-round with a huge staff of volunteers and advisors and people from everywhere who look at the films and help us craft a program that we think represents the best in emerging independent film. And one of the things that we do each year is invite a filmmaker in residence. And that person is a person who exemplifies the spirit of independent filmmaking and who also has a body of work that is recognized for excellence. And Tasha Van Zandt, who's here right now and is going to give the master class, is this year's filmmaker in residence. She brought with her a film called AFTER ANTARCTICA, which we screened a couple of days ago. It is also available on the virtual platform. And Will Steger is here, who the film is about, as well as Sebastian Zeck, who is a producer of that film. And one of the things our filmmakers in residence do is to offer a master class, and that is what we are here today. And Tasha will talk, I'm sure, for a while, and then we'll open it up for questions. If you've never been here, this is the Woods Hole Community Hall. It's the center and the heart of Woods Hole, as is the fire station where our box office is. If you need to use the restroom, it's through that exit door and down the stairs. And if you need to leave before this is over, the exit is behind you. So if you wouldn't mind, please silencing your cell phones, that would be great. And we will get started. This is being recorded, so if you have any objection to that, too bad.
Great. Thanks so much, Judy. And thank you all for coming today. I'm so excited to be here with you all. And as Judy said, I directed the film After Antarctica, but we're really lucky to have Will here and Sebastian too. And so I'd love for this to really be a conversation. I'll be walking through my process of making the film, but any questions at all that you have as we go, please feel free to jump in. So I am a documentary filmmaker, a photographer, cinematographer, and producer, and I'm dedicated to telling stories about our human connection to nature. And today we're going to be talking about the power of eyewitness storytelling. So how we can really tell those stories about our personal connections to the environment around us. And I'll also be walking through my process that led to the creation of After Antarctica. So how many of you have had a chance to see the film? Out of curiosity. Awesome. So for those of you who haven't, After Antarctica follows polar explorer Will Steger's lifelong journey as an eyewitness to the greatest changes across both poles. And in 1989 to 1990, Will led the longest dog sled crossing of Antarctica in history. It was 7 months, 4,000 miles across the coldest continent on Earth. But the mission of the expedition was more than a personal best, as Will often says. The purpose of it was to draw awareness to the need to reinstate the Antarctic Treaty. And so the film really follows that journey, but also now Will today as he heads out on the ice in the Arctic, and his lifelong commitment to the environment in our polar regions. So I actually, in terms of how I got started, I first learned about Will at a very young age, and I grew up in Minnesota, which is where Will is from. And growing up there, Will was my childhood hero and a local legend. And I remember reading National Geographic magazines and tearing out pictures and putting them on my wall from Will's expeditions in Antarctica, and dreaming to one day be able to go to Antarctica myself. When I think about Will's work and the impact it had on me at that time, I was so inspired by the way that he was using his platform as a tool to draw together others in conversations about our environment, and also use images to really show the power of our natural world. So really, ever since I was a kid, I knew I wanted to be a storyteller. I was the first generation on my mother's side to be born in the United States, and I come from a very brave line of women who inspired me to pave my own path. My mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother all immigrated together from the Soviet Union, and when they left, they had to leave everything behind. So one of the only things they could bring with them were photographs. And I remember being very young and looking at these weathered and worn black and white images from my mother's life in the Soviet Union, and hearing stories about family members and friends and neighborhoods and places that I had never before seen, but that I instantly felt transported to and connected to through these images. They felt like these magical portals that were just taking me to this other world outside of my own, and I was so mesmerized by the power of photography. So, from a very young age, then I just knew I wanted to learn more about photography. And I quickly fell in love with taking pictures and was always behind a camera. And then in middle school, working in the darkroom, through high school, working in the darkroom and developing my own pictures and learning everything I could about the process. And then later on in high school, I was accepted to an arts program where you could pick a major, and I focused on media arts, and that's really where my path into documentary got started. I remember we did a class with Super 8 and just immediately falling in love not only with the image, but with the moving image and the power of taking these images and using them as a tool to really tell a story. So that's kind of when I started falling in love with documentary film. And from there in college, my love for documentary continued to grow, and I designed my own major and was really focused on how can I start to use these stories and these images as tools to make impact. Because the older I got, the more I was able to travel and have all of these experiences, and really looking at how can I actually start to use this lens as something that can make positive change. So soon after graduating, I had the opportunity to start working with National Geographic expeditions and leading photography and filmmaking expeditions around the world. So I was able to teach these workshops and work with groups of people. And through that process of teaching and leading, I had to also really learn along the way. And so it was a huge experience that taught me so much about how to really adapt and work in extreme environments, and just the power of working with groups of people around a story. So around that time of working with National Geographic expeditions, I saw Will give a talk called his Eyewitness Lecture. And the eyewitness talk that Will gives is where he shares the story of the changes he's witnessed across both poles. And I was immediately so inspired by hearing Will share his own story. And after hearing this, I introduced myself and we met, and I was able to share the impact his work had had on my own path, and the impact his story had had on me. And we quickly started talking. Soon after meeting, I had the chance where Will invited me and Sebastian here to go up to Ely, Minnesota, which is Will's homestead. It was about 4 hours north of Minneapolis, where I was living at the time, and I remember going up for the very first time and seeing Will's wilderness center, which he had actually started building around the time of the Trans-Antarctica expedition. And when I first walked into Will's cabin, right up there above the wood-burning stove is a drawing that Will drew of the Steger Wilderness Center. And looking out the window, I could see it, that it's been built exactly the same after all these years. And I was so inspired by the way that he has set his mind to these goals and has worked tirelessly to make them come to life. So it was pretty instantaneous that I felt like this was a story I wanted to tell. And in terms of the first steps, really those first steps were in getting to know each other and building a relationship together, and for Will to be able to really process if this was a journey he wanted to go on. So we spent a lot of time talking and getting to know each other and hearing about Will's expeditions and journeys. And I think the best part of this entire process has been really being able to build this from a place of collaboration and amplifying the stories that Will himself has been telling over all of these years. So in the very early stages, so much of that time was just spent of Sebastian and I going up to the homestead, seeing this incredible community, and hearing countless stories from Will about journeys to Antarctica, to the Arctic, and the present day journeys that he's doing now. So from the very, very beginning, we knew we wanted to tell the story from a place of eyewitness. But there were so many different stories we could tell because Will has done so many incredible adventures. So to start with, we started doing a lot of preliminary interviews, and we set up our first interview with Will where we really covered his legacy and backstory, the expeditions that he's done. And from there, we're able to take that, turn it into transcripts, and just start pulling out all of the themes and messages that felt like they were connecting with that theme of eyewitness and with the messages that Will felt like he wanted to share. So a lot of it was just built on years of friendship and conversations. But the more that we talked, the more I learned how deeply Trans-Antarctica had influenced his life and how present that journey still was, not only for Will, but for our planet in so many ways. Especially when we started setting out to make this film, it really felt like in so many ways history repeating itself in terms of our need for international cooperation now. And so we wanted that to feel very present in the film, but we also wanted to be able to juxtapose that with what it feels like to look back on something that was so impactful to his life while he's continuing to do these incredible expeditions now. So once we had this vision for the documentary of After Antarctica, the next step in my process was building a creative treatment to be able to share with Will. And so I really put together the idea of the log line of the film, of this is the mission statement of the story we're trying to convey. And we had a lot of talks around that of what Will felt was most true to his story, what he felt were the messages that he most wanted to share with others. And so we kept talking, brainstorming, and filming for quite some time. And then from there, we had the opportunity to go with Will for the first start of his Arctic solo journey. So Sebastian and I, because we were such a small team and very much an independent filmmaking team, we were just a two-person production on that. So there were so many steps that went into that, but I think, for really how we got started with filming the Arctic solo was looking at how can we film this in a way where we can go in and start to document the landscape, document Will's process, but then be sure to leave so that there's space for Will to really have his solo journey and not be obtrusive to that. So the first time that we came in, we were able to collaborate with Will's longtime friend, Dave, who's this incredible bush pilot, and we went in by bush plane. He communicated with Will by satellite phone, and found Will's coordinates. And I remember flying in when we first go to meet with Will and seeing this little speck on the horizon in just vast whiteness of Will looking up at us and us landing and going and filming with him. But that moment had such an impact on the shape that the rest of the film would take, because to actually see how vast this landscape was with my own eyes and how small we are in the face of that, it really kind of started to set the tone for what the film would become. So we had the honor of being able to film with Will on this Arctic solo journey, but then also coming back to the homestead and spending so much time, as you'll see in the film, having conversations and filming Will's daily life there. And alongside of filming this process, because we were really building it and evolving it as we went, we started spending time in the edit. So every time we would go and film with Will, we would take back our footage, start reviewing it, and really again start honing in on selecting the pieces that felt like it fit this roadmap we were all creating in terms of this eyewitness statement that we wanted to tell. So, you know, in the beginning, I had this vision of wanting to be able to juxtapose the past and present and be able to have the structure really kind of feel like this space of liminal time, because that's how life feels, is we don't look at our lives one step of the way and that's it. We really are constantly learning and growing and reflecting on these moments that have been so pivotal to us. So Will has lived such an extraordinary life and has really paved his own path, and we wanted to be able to evoke that in the structure as best as we could. So it was definitely a challenge, because we were looking at creating a structure where I think, you know, often when you look at story structure, you have your typical narrative arc, and we wanted to be able to bring that to life and show the highs and lows of the Trans-Antarctica journey, all of the tension and the joy that came with that expedition. But also, we wanted to be able to show Will's journey now, which is much more of this incredible reflective space. So as we continued filming, we started thinking about the landscapes themselves as characters. So when we're in the past in Trans-Antarctica, much of that is our incredible archival footage, and it feels very adventure-driven. You can hear the storms. There was an incredible team that documented that at the time, and it feels very active and forward-moving. And so in our present day, as we started cutting, we had some footage that felt much more active, but we found that the more we stripped that away and had the present day space be more reflective, it almost served as our interview setting for the film. So it could become this world where we could experience Will's connection with this place and let the landscape speak for itself. And really let it be a place where we could learn about Will's backstory, about his personal connection to nature, and start to help answer that question that many have when they see people setting off into the unknown of, why do you do this? So in terms of bringing the Arctic and Antarctica to life, some of our techniques in doing that were really listening to the landscape. What are the sounds that we hear? What does it feel like when we're there? For us in the Arctic, everything felt very still. You could almost hear your heartbeat when you step out on the ice. And it feels like a very meditative place. So in terms of our cinematography, we really looked at how can we let the camera be locked off? If we're following Will, how can we let it feel like we're in a space of reflection and really on this journey with Will, but in a way that feels very observational. And in addition to that, we also realized from that first bush plane flight that we had going in, of how when you're out there on the ice, it looks almost like you're in a snow globe. You're surrounded by this vast white area where it's hard to tell the scale. So we knew we wanted to bring in aerial cinematography. And since Sebastian and I were a very small team, the way we structured that is having Sebastian film much of our beautiful cinematography on the ground, And then I had to quickly learn how to do aerial cinematography since we didn't have another person to bring with us. So there was a lot of trial and error, mostly trial and error. But we would go out and keep learning as we went. And I think, such a lesson that we've had as filmmakers on this is that as long as you set your eyes to that North Star of the goal, you can find the way to get there. There's a lot of times where we couldn't see the roadmap or how to do it, but we were able to just keep going out and learning from Will to put one foot in front of the other. And so, I think in terms of how we approach the cinematography became a really big element of how to bring places like the Arctic and Antarctica to life as their own subjects in the film. So then, in terms of challenges of filming in extreme locations, we were very fortunate in that we had Will. So, Will was really our guide of how to prepare, how to approach, and because we were just coming in at the start and end of this journey, we didn't have to face any challenges like Will has on these expeditions. But we also wanted to be able to really show people what these environments feel like, even if we weren't there for the entire time. So one thing that we did to achieve this, since we knew we'd be leaving, is we gave Will a camera so that Will could document some of the journey himself. And you see some of that footage utilized in the film. And that became an important piece to be able to really build this around Will's own lens and the world through his eyes and through his voice. So in addition to Will filming some of these moments when we were not there himself, another great thing that he did as a fellow documentarian is his daily dispatches. So both in the present day, you'll notice in the film, that Will would record these daily dispatches to check in, where people could follow along on his journey. And we were able to utilize the recordings of those as we built the narrative, and when you hear his voiceover now. And it was really important to us in the structure, since we wanted to juxtapose past and present, that when we are in the present day, we're entirely in the present day. So all of that audio was comprised of dispatches that Will has been doing now, to interviews that we've been doing with Will. But then when we're in the past, it was so important to us that the past speaks for itself as well. So instead of breaking that world of these memories in the past and cutting to sit-down interviews now, we wanted it to feel completely immersive. So the way that we did that is Will gave us around 180 hours of audio journals that he took along the way on Transantarctica, and they're the most incredible tapes to listen to, and Sebastian and I had so much fun getting to put on headphones and listen to the sounds of the storms and the wind as Will would describe the journey that they had been on. So we really spent a lot of time thinking of how to build that narrative in the past from that audio, as well as the incredible footage that the team in Transantarctica had captured, some of which had been synced with sound, which was incredible. And the other big part of what we filmed with Will was, you'll see in the film, going back to Antarctica with Will in the present day. And again, it was so important to us in filming that scene that we wanted to hear Will talking about the changes that have taken place, but while Will was actually there. But we also wanted it in a way where it didn't feel like it was a competing storyline. So really looking at how to weave that thread in as kind of this new chapter, but again in a way that felt very reflective, very active, and where Will could really speak to the work that he's been doing with his nonprofit Climate Generation, and especially with his work with the Steger Wilderness Center. So there was a lot of puzzle pieces in building this film, and it took a great deal of work to figure out how do we structure this in a way where we can really look at the structure differently, but make sure that it's guiding us along, keeping us engaged, and carrying us on the journey without doing our best not to kind of break that pattern once we would cut from past to present. So we worked with a great team in our edit. Dana Lehman was our co-editor and Don Bernier was our editor. And we spent so much time with them really looking at this roadmap, looking at the scenes that we were starting to build, and then just starting to play with what happens if we, put something non-linearly, what happens when we move it back, and just really looking at each scene kind of as its own puzzle piece. Let's see here. So, I guess there's so many more things I can say about the process, but just for now, does anyone have any questions that come to mind?
Before that you started mapping out the editorial process, what kind of access did you have to those archival, and how did you think you were going to create that?
Yeah, so the question was kind of before starting to map out what kind of access did we have to the archival. For us, once we realized we wanted to tell the story of Trans-Antarctica, Will had so much of the archive himself, so Will gave us around 30 hours of raw material from the original French crew on the Trans-Antarctica expedition. And then we had those around 180 hours of audio journal tapes from Will as well. So that was really, I think, largely as we were starting to structure, we had that as our roadmap, and also just conversations with Will about very much learning about the expedition, of how they got started, how they set off, just really kind of on a linear level at first, laying out everything Will has done very chronologically. And then from there, once we felt like we had all of that information, looking at, okay, now that we have this, how can we kind of start playing and piecing each scene next to each other in a way that feels like it's having a conversation between the past and present. But we definitely did a lot of work with outlining, and I think that is something that has been very helpful to me in my process. Is I love looking at 3-act story structure, looking at a typical outline of your inciting incident and your midpoint and low points, and how to kind of structure around that. But then from there, again, always looking to that as our anchor, and then how can we kind of build and step away from that in a way that still feels rooted in story, but feels like we're approaching it in this very personal lens to Will. Yeah.
You answered this question before for me, but I wish you'd share it with the rest of the crowd. So
Sure.
At the end of After Antarctica, there was a scene, a set of scenes, where a guy goes missing, and there's a rescue effort. And I'd like you to describe those scenes, and then talk about how you built tension, which I thought was just fabulous.
Oh, thank you. So the question was, for those of you who've seen the film, there is a scene where one of the team members from Japan, Keizo, goes missing. It's a scene where the team didn't know if Keizo would survive, and it happened very close to the finish line. So the team was about 16 miles to the finish line, one of the very last days. Everything seemed like just a breeze to be able to get there. But as Antarctica goes, the weather can change so quickly, and Keizo was lost in a storm. And so what happened when we talked to Will about this moment, because it was such an impactful moment for everyone on the expedition, and especially Will, who had so much of the responsibility as one of the team leaders, when that actually happened, they had this night. So they had been searching, they had this night, and they had to continue going back out. But they all had to take this moment where they didn't know if he would survive. They would have to basically recharge to head back out, all the while wondering, are they going to find Keizo dead or alive? And kind of the hopelessness of being in this wild weather where there's nothing really they can control other than their search mission. So we knew that there was this night where everyone was very uncertain about what happened to Keizo. And we had footage from the Trans-Antarctica archival world, but we wanted the audience to also feel that tension and to also feel that curiosity, much like Will and the team had felt. So one way that we approached that structurally with our team was what happens when we pull back out of the archival world into the present day, and now we're kind of bringing together both the past and present timelines, where Will is actually starting to reflect on this moment in the present tense. And you know, in terms of that approach, that way everyone who's in the audience can be on this journey with the team. And so when we go back to Trans-Antarctica and the team's continuing to search, we're right there with them, with having no idea, are they going to find Keizo or not? So I think really there's so many challenges to approaching structure in this way, but also so many gifts that it gives you in terms of really being able to emotionally invite the audience in a way that feels very connected to the person we're telling story and kind of this, firsthand level. So that was how we approached that scene. But also for us, even though we knew the outcome of Keizo in building the film, listening to Will's audio tapes, seeing the footage, there were so many moments even us were on the edge of our seat. And so we wanted to be sure that people could feel that as well. Yeah.
I think one of the greatest gifts about this film is the relationship that you two have and the way you're able to build it collaboratively, and that's what created this film. I wonder if you can speak to what is difficult about that, because I find in a really close, and you can both speak to this, I bet, but in my own work, when I work with someone that I'm really close to, it makes the story so much richer, but then it's harder for me to take a step back and know what to do editorially and from my own lens, and where the two of you kind of diverge or came together or have conflict around that.
Oh, that's such a good question. I mean, for me, I think this has been, in so many ways, our own expedition and the greatest journey of my life. And so, this friendship with Will has been so incredible and has allowed us to tell. I can't imagine telling this story in this way had it not been for our friendship. And so it was really important to us in crafting the story to constantly be in, with all of our interviews, if we had an idea for a scene or anything, really having Will speak to it in his own words. I think the biggest challenge for me was that Will has done so many incredible adventures, and even just with Trans-Antarctica, there were so many incredible scenes and moments and backstory and history that we wanted to bring into the film. But sometimes the more that we would go into some of the backstory of how Trans-Antarctica got started or some of the different backstories of the team members, the more it felt like the Trans-Antarctica story versus the Will's memoir and story. So I think our biggest challenge as filmmakers was really that process of where and how to cut away these incredible moments and adventures Will's been on. And I often say to Will, I wish we could tell a 100-hour part story about Will, because there would still be stories to tell. I mean, he's from his North Pole expeditions to all of the solos he's doing now outside of the ones we filmed, to, in Trans-Antarctica, the way that he actually met Jean-Louis, one of the co-leaders, was out there on the ice at the North Pole. These two wandering shadows in the middle of vast white find each other, which Will could speak to better than I could. But there was just so many incredible stories, and I think we, in our edit, we had really, throughout the process of creating this, at points would have very long assemblies and very long rough cuts. And we'd have to really look at what feels more on the scale of Trans-Antarctica story or Will's story, and how to keep leaning into Will's story. But there's so many things that I wish we could have included. So definitely something I'd love to do, as we're working towards distribution, is really looking at ways to have an interactive platform where people can, the goal is click on the map of their route and learn about some of the story from Will and Jean-Louis or backstories of the other team members, and weave some of that in terms of our impact. But yeah, I wish there's so much more I wish we could have told. What do you think, Will? Yeah.
Couple comments.
Yeah.
One is, first of all, yours is Sebastian's absolute total commitment to producing film. I mean, when you were up in the Arctic, I don't think you ever slept. You guys were out, there's this energy of a 24-hour life. Same thing in Antarctica. We were always out filming. I would sleep for a while, get up, and we're still filming. And so it does take, that blood, sweat, and tears, of course, to do. And when you really commit to the project, it's possible to do that. What I was very thankful for was you actually, I felt, answered in a very good way why you do expositions. And it's almost, I think as a first person, I can't answer that. It's a difficult one to answer. I mean, what's really going on? And I think one way you did it, which I've never seen in a documentary, on the soul of the film, you allowed silence to be there. And that really was what really drove it home, what it's all about. And the way you coached that silence, and, it was quite remarkable, because silence socially is one of the most uncomfortable things in the world. But you got away with doing it several times and for a long period of time. It just lets you get things going on in the peace mind. And then how you incorporate a small little silence. And I've seen it probably 12, 14 times now. Sometimes I see something different all the time. And the film that you guys did was really, it's an act of trust and love. We spent a couple of years together, first just getting to know each other. And then I just told open up whatever you needed. And the problem was there was so much archives and that. It was there to produce. I didn't see anything for 2 years. When it was over with, a year ago last April, we rented out the little movie theater in Newry. And I went in there with a friend alone, and I saw this movie, and that was pretty unusual, I thought. And you could have made that in any way you wanted to. It was a real honor to me, but I think the world is showing the reality of that, and this precious environment, saving this environment, and what you can do in cooperation, the message that we so dearly need right now. There's so much horrible things going on, and listening to it all the time too. That we need this message of hope that we can carry on, especially in cooperation. The world itself isolates us so deeply. We isolate ourselves a lot.
Thank you, Will.
It's such a pleasure to travel with you.
It's been the best journey ever. And thank you, Will, that means the world to me. And I think that has been the best part of this process is if we're sharing someone's story, how can we do it where we're amplifying the story? And it's not about going in and making our own story. It's about really collaborating and hearing what Will had to say and how to bring that to life through the film and the spirit of Will to life through the film. And I think in terms of the silence, when Will would talk to us about these expeditions, Will would often talk about, we'd ask about what does it sound like, what does it feel like, and he would describe this absence of sound or the way that it feels to hear the ice or the little details of the sounds of birds flying overhead. And then when we had the opportunity to go out there with Will, we actually got to experience that ourselves. And it was something that we had felt so inspired by, and we wanted to be able to have other people experience that. So like Will said, it's hard to sit in silence, but it's so needed, and we can learn so much when we just listen to our environment. And so we wanted, I think in this film, Will is our vehicle driving us through this world of our polar regions that we feel so disconnected from. But through these very personal firsthand stories, we can connect to these places, the sounds of ice, the feeling of what it means to be in the Arctic in a way that really kind of gives us that personal connection that we might not otherwise have. And I think especially in terms of when Will talks about the Larsen B ice shelf or the changes to our ice shelves, I was always so impacted hearing Will speak about it from his personal lens and the way that he had had this personal experience on this expedition, and then to see that change, the way that has impacted his life, I think gave me an entirely new understanding of what the loss of these ice shelves means. So that was also something that was so important to us, is the more that we could connect Will alongside of these landscapes, the goal was that more personally people could connect to the loss and changes of the ice. Yeah, or I'll have you go first, and I'll have you next.
You started to touch on this in talking about like what you chose to include and what you chose to film the editing for. And one thing that I was curious about watching the film was the other members of the expedition. And for folks that haven't seen it, you're really only seeing them through the archival, and then it isn't until like the end during the credits that you see them reunite. So I'm curious about the choice about how to include the characters.
That's a great question too. So we had the opportunity to interview many of the team members, and we also just fell in love with their characters and their stories, and they're each such fascinating individuals. So we really wanted to be sure to, when we would build an archival scene, looking through every moment of it with our editor to see what angles or shots or questions or comments did other people in the group have, and be sure that we were trying to get coverage from all the team members that we could. And then in terms of that present day story, we knew that we wanted, towards the end of the film, for people to feel the uncertainty that the team had felt in terms of what happened to Keizo. And we also knew that we wanted to keep that balance focused in on Will's life story. And so we found that there was a lot of work that we did and testing things out. So, sometimes we would bring in more of a team member's story, or bring in the team's reunion sooner, or put more emphasis on it. But sometimes the more that we would go into that realm, again, the more that it felt like we wanted to know more Trans-Antarctica, and it was kind of taking us into that world. So we ultimately ended up building it in this way where it's kind of all through Will's perspective, memory, and lens, but then at the end, making sure we have this space to see that the team has all come back together, that they're all still just as incredibly close, and to be able to see that this vision that Will had worked on in Antarctica has come to life through the Steger Center. So, there was a lot of different versions that we worked on in the edit before this version that we've landed upon, but that was kind of always the balancing act, is weighing how much emphasis does it put on one storyline or the other. Yeah.
I'll preface this with, I have not had the opportunity to see the movie yet, so I will gladly accept just go watch the movie as an answer. But I'm curious, it sounds like you used a lot of older footage, but working with a landscape like Antarctica and this environment, and as you were saying, when you're flying in, it's just a speck out there. How did you, I guess, from a cinematography standpoint, try to show the vast, incredible experience of the environment when there's so much white and it's very much all the same? But maybe that's the beauty of that space, is in simplicity. It is beautiful, but were there any challenges with trying to convey that?
Yes, that's a great question. So, yeah, the question was the challenges of conveying these spaces that it seems like it could be so repetitive, or how do you show the scale in a space like the Arctic? And so for us, aerial cinematography was a huge part of that. So I did a lot of the aerial cinematography that you see in the film, and then Sebastian did so much of the beautiful cinematography we have in the present day. And that process of the aerial cinematography is a lot of Will's patience, a lot of us having Will, go and hauling his canoe, and us flying the drone off after and trying to capture what that looks like in this landscape. And visually, we wanted to really be able to show the range of scale. So if we were in a scene where Will is reflecting on something personal to his life, we might have that take place in Will's tent or in a moment where we can see Will's face and see the close-ups and really sit in stillness and feel more like we're going into Will's thoughts and mind. But if we're in a moment where we're really talking about the beauty of this place and we're talking about the changes happening, we really want to be able to see that human connection to this vast landscape. So we would really pull back and utilize these aerial shots. And then additionally, because of when we were filming Will goes on these solos at the spring breakup. So he's really out there at a time when the ice is changing very quickly. So from the first to last day that we would go in with Will, we would see the ice very rapidly change. So we also worked on, crafting scenes from that first part of the journey where everything looks like solid ice and you can see some of the wildlife from Will's camera and just this like very kind of whiteout condition. So towards the end, we had really working with the different characteristics of ice. So you'll see some scenes where Will's walking on the ice as it's melting, and it's this very like brilliant blue color, and you can hear and see the ice dripping and changing. So that was also important to us in terms of the arc of the ice as its own character, is to see it kind of change throughout the film.
I was kind of curious, how many days do you actually have of shooting in the Arctic? And then also, was it more difficult to kind of create the storyline you wanted when you were actually shooting what you were like shooting it in the Arctic, or when like the archival footage? Like, what was more difficult as
In terms of what was more difficult in kind of approaching the storyline of the Arctic and also the Antarctic, and then what our process was like for being out there. So again, we came in kind of at that first expedition with Will, and we would go out for like, the whole trip as a whole is like a few week journey because it takes a long time to get to these locations, and there was days of waiting with the bush pilot for a signal from Will to come in to his coordinates, and but really, we really let Will have that space for the 60-day solo being out there on his own. And then same again with the end of the expedition and Antarctica. Those were kind of like a few weeks here and there. But in terms of the structure, I think for us, because we'd had so many conversations with Will, we knew there were things that he's described to us that we wanted to capture, like the process of setting up your tent in windy conditions, or the process of what does it look like for how he gets water, or how he, kind of the 24-hour light of Will going to bed at a time when it looks completely bright outside. And so there was things and elements we knew that we were going to include from Will's story that we wanted to show. And a big theme of that was repetition, because as Will describes in the film, I love how Will says it's like a mobile Zen monastery. So there's like a lot of repetition in walking and hauling and setting up and getting your water. And so we wanted to be able to capture that kind of pattern. And then I think, again, in terms of approach, we were very conscious of the fact that this was kind of more of a meditative space. So doing more that was like locked off on tripod. If we were flying drone, thinking of, are there moments where we can just keep the drone steady and just really kind of have it be still. And then in terms of structure, so we were kind of filming in scenes as we'd go. So we might say, this is the scene, we're going to go film, Will's about to go set up his tent, so this will be our like tent setup scene. Or this is a scene where Will's hauling, and we want to show, kind of the change of the landscape where you see the big crack in the ice and things like that, so this will be that scene. So we'd definitely be conscious of filming in scenes. I think in terms of filming in scenes, something that is helpful is I try to always have in mind, like, what is the message we're trying to convey? What's the purpose of the scene? What's truthful to the person who is doing this action? So, like, we would often just say, well, what's your process? We'll kind of observe and film it, and might have him, go back again and get another angle, but really kind of staying true to what that process looks like. But then in terms of the edit, a whole nother layer is added into that of how to bring a scene to life, where we know we have kind of these puzzle pieces and building blocks, but then really thinking through, okay, now how does the purpose of this scene connect to the purpose of the next scene and the next scene, and what happens when we move that around, and what meaning does that give this moment if it comes after this. So another thing we really thought through was match cuts. So in Antarctica, before we'd go on the Arctic journey, for example, you might see some scenes where Will's journaling in his tent, and we had seen this great footage of Will journaling in Antarctica 30 years ago. So we'd really think through how can we kind of also film some of these moments and everyday things that Will does on the ice, but in a way where we knew we wanted to be able to juxtapose that with the past. So kind of always through the lens of how can we film this in a way that can be a bridge to the Antarctica footage.
So you had no drone experience. You weren't learning it without low stakes. You had the cold, which protected the battery, and the stakes were high. You need to move your story forward. Can you tell us about a moment of darkness where this isn't going to work? What's the moment where you said, "Got it, this is going to be great"?
Oh, that's a good question. So actually, somewhere in the slideshow, there's a picture of this moment. So when it comes up, I'll point it out. But on one of the last days with Will out on the ice, we were filming with the drone, and we're in very whiteout conditions. If you look in one direction, as far as the eye can see, it's just a flat bed of white ice and white sky. And this was one of the days in Antarctica that was also a bit of a challenge, but there's one where it's a kind of a top-down picture you guys will see here. And for that, the challenge was that we put the drone up and we started filming with Will, and Will was out hauling, and we were, flying the drone after him. And there was all of these incredible moments that ended up being moments we used in the film, but we didn't have another backup. All of that footage was actually on the drone itself. So right as we're getting close to land it, we capture this shot where Will's on the horizon, walking towards us, and you can start to see the wind started blowing, and you could see it blowing the ice around Will, and it was just one of our favorite shots. The moment when we got it, we felt like this is the shot that we've been looking for to illustrate what it looks like for Will to be out here. And then very quickly after thinking that, the drone started to go haywire. So I go, okay, I'm gonna bring it back in, we'll land it. And as I'm bringing it back, it starts going the opposite direction, full speed. And so I'm trying to bring it back. It keeps going further and further. Here's the shot. So it was kind of right after this moment, I'm bringing it back in. And there was nothing I could do. I mean, I was trying everything, and it just had a mind of its own. So at the last minute, there's a way where you can crash land the drone. So I'm like, that's it. We were very high up in the sky, and I was like, I'm going to crash land it, and then we're going to have to figure out how to trek out to get it so we don't leave this drone out in the ice. So I start to crash land it, and right as I see this little dot in the distance getting down towards the ice, I brought it back up again, and it reset, and I brought it back, landed it, and then looked at Sebastian and Will and said, I never want to do that again. Yeah. But we got all the footage, and the shots made it in. So that was a good feeling after we got it back. Yeah. Yeah.
I know documentary filmmakers and teams have to be concerned about, does your presence in the middle of a situation change the reality of what is happening in the situation? Did you have to worry about that with the personal story, or even the ecological side of this is a precious, delicate world we're in, and we have to be extra careful?
Yes, that's a great question. I mean, for us, because of the way that we had set up the shoot, we were really coming in at a point where we knew Will was going to be leaving off on the solo part of the journey without us. So we were really there to film those early stages of the process, but also really consciously in how we went in, knowing we want to film this in a way where we can't follow Will's entire solo journey. And then in terms of what that looked like, I think there was definitely scenes we wanted to capture or scenes we wanted to help illustrate things that are part of his daily life, but always, I think a lot of having Will say, okay, Will, show us how you do this, and show us again, and but doing it in a way where we were trying to be as observational as possible. So also there was a lot of days where Will gets up early and is ready to go, and so like Will mentioned, maybe sometimes that meant staying up all night, but being ready to go and film as Will is, to be on that schedule and timeline, and then working around Will in that way. And same with his life at home is, you'll see some observational moments in the film where we really wanted to be able to have those moments to be kind of more of a fly on the wall and observe. But then in terms of the impact of coming in, it was also very important to us to, for example, that story with the drone, in my mind, the further it went, I was thinking this is going to be a long journey to go and recover it because we don't want to leave anything out there on the ice. So that was also, really important to us, and of course to Will, is how can we, if we're, telling a story about an environment, do our best to limit the impact, but of course there's also so many challenges that go into that. So really thinking of like, what kind of impact can we make with the story, and how can we lessen our footprint as best as we can. Yeah.
With being out there, and that was your first time out there, is that correct?
That was the first time in the Arctic, and same with Antarctica.
So going there, and folks like Will, seems like whenever you leave, you're itching to get back. To go, are you excited to go back? Or are you like, I made it, I had a great experience, but I can do it without that?
Oh man, Will's passion for this place has been very contagious. So Sebastian and Will just went back on another solo, which actually, Will, you could tell everyone about that. But and the whole time we were just dreaming of being back out there. So we just absolutely loved it, and the people we were able to meet, both kind of before the ice and after, were just so incredible, and that landscape is so so unique and so beautiful. It really does feel like that was part of the challenges when we're telling stories about a place that feels like another planet, is how can we make it feel relatable and connected and human. But because it does feel like you're going to another planet, it's just completely eye-opening and life-changing, and so we definitely want to go back. And then Will still continues to do these incredible solos, and just got back, was it 6 weeks ago, Will? 6 weeks ago from another solo. Yeah.
One photo you have where he's walking along the water to the right. What's the Interstellar poster?
This one was in Antarctica, and this was quite a day, just a flurry of snow everywhere, and all of our gear was getting soaked, but we couldn't pull ourselves away from being out there on the shore. Fortunately, we did before it was too late, but it's so beautiful there. Yeah. Any other questions?
It seems pretty clear that from the beginning you wanted to tell like an eyewitness, observer, fly on the wall sort of story, but did you ever have a moment, especially, knowing your background and the way that Will inspired you, where you were like, maybe I'll make this reflexive, or include myself in it, or talk about kind of the journey, my first step on Arctic, that sort of thing?
Well, that's interesting. I think for me, I'm very camera shy and have stage fright, so so not so much. But we definitely thought of different. I knew I wanted it to be Will's voice, but there was a time where we thought of including other people's voices too. So the original team members, some of Will's collaborators on other expeditions, like from the North Pole, and dear friends Will has had over the years. So we actually, early on, in addition to interviewing Will, had interviewed some other people too, and they had great interviews. But as we started building the story, I felt more and more like I wanted this to be told from Will's perspective and his own voice. So we started to see what it feels like to strip those voices away, and that's the more and more it kind of started to feel like it was having its own unique tone that we wanted to explore with the film. But, and those other interviews ended up being really helpful as just getting to know Will and these wonderful memories and stories. But yeah, it was definitely challenging to strip those away, but I'm glad we ended up doing it this way. Yeah. But that was another, thing with this is we also wanted to break away from the sit-down interview world as much as we could. And so that's where with the present day Arctic solo, we started to think of, if this is more of a reflective space, what happens if this is kind of our interview world? And that was part of the approach there. Yeah, great. Any other questions? Yes.
I have a lot of questions. But
Great.
A lot of people do. Great.
Okay.
Maybe this is sort of like gauche to ask about, but I'm just curious if, like, in terms of funding this project,
Mhm.
if you sort of funded for the expedition as a whole, or how Will's sort of personal trip funding and your film funding intertwined or didn't?
That's a great question too. So this was my first feature that I've directed, and it can be challenging to fund a first feature. And so we had been in the process of applying to grants, applying to funders, but this was also happening alongside of that and was something we didn't want to miss. So since Sebastian and I are both cinematographers, I remember looking at each other and saying, okay, can we do this as a two-person crew and just go out there and make it happen? And we're both from Minnesota originally, so that made it easier with going back to film in Minnesota and just driving up to Will's. But yeah, in terms of the Arctic, Will was on his own journey, and we just found our way there with this incredible bush pilot, and then on the other time, from taking out a sled and but yeah, very, very, very small budget at first. But then later on, once we really had our scenes and our rough cut, that's when we brought on an incredible team, and we were able to show them the vision for the film and get funding that way. Another big part of the support for us was with organizations, and so we had some support through Sundance Institute, Film Independent. So there's definitely great organizations too with grants, and that was really helpful.
Some tips and tricks on working lean and mean with just two people. How do you divide the labor? What were some of the strategies?
That's a good question. Oh man, I mean, Sebastian, does anything come to mind for you? There's so many, I feel like.
I don't know. Like she said, we're both cinematographers, and Tasha did all of the aerial. I wanted Tasha to be able to, as a producer, I wanted her to be able to focus on directing and be in that space and not have to worry about any of the technical aspects of filming while we're in the Arctic. So we sort of decided that I would handle most of the cinematography and the audio. So we had a mic on Will and had audio running into the camera, so I had headphones on and I was monitoring everything. And so I just wanted Tasha to be able to really focus on the directing side of things rather than technical.
But it was definitely I think, and if you're going to do something with a small team, it's making sure that everyone is on board to wear multiple hats. And so there's days where, I was able to really focus on directing and catching up with Will and learning about what he's doing. Sebastian was able to film. There was, days where we would trade off. There's days where it comes down to downloading or charging and everything, and it's all hands on deck. So it's very much full on, the smaller the team. But the benefits of that was that we were able to have this journey and spend so much in-depth time with Will without a big, huge crew around, and then also just be able to get to these places where there's no room for additional people.
Yeah, and in a sense, it is almost easier to just work with, just us. Then we're not delegating. It's not delegating any work. We work really well together. We both have similar, basic points of aesthetic, and we both know what we're looking for in terms of coverage for the scene or how to shoot something. So there's no need for us to delegate work to a whole crew.
But it also depends so much on the project. Like, I think that is such a good point about the way we were able to get to that stage, I think is so much work in pre-production. And so there was so many weeks of talking with Will about what it will be like when we get there, talking with people on the ground about what do we do once we're there, thinking through every single detail and with our gear, making sure we have backups for everything. So yeah, in filming in extreme conditions, just so much, I think, of the really challenging part comes into pre-production, of planning as best as you can for something that's a little bit impossible to plan. But the more that you're over-prepared, then once we get there, there was so many themes, shots, different things that we'd had prepared and talked about that we were able to kind of just be in action. Yeah. Will?
Say a couple about Tasha staff, very incredible team working together. I'm sure you can read something about it. And collaborate back and forth, read. And talk sometimes, tense sometimes, and anything in the scene, you know, you get once. Lay the way, you both look at the lens, so you're composing that sometimes. We've been working together for over 10 years. I've really enjoyed watching you through how you work together in tense situations too. We work hard with each other. We wanted to. It kept it cool.
You know, it's like an expedition, you know, you've got to, when you're in this environment, you have your goal and you've got to just work together as teamwork to make it happen. And the more that, you know, like Will was saying, there's moments that are really tense or really hard, or where you get one shot, and so the more that you're just in tune and prepared, the smoother it goes.
The financing wasn't the Godfather or anything here. They used their savings and borrowed money. I was really impressed with that. I didn't know. I was on a small budget. I thought, that's part of what you're doing in the document. You figure out how to financially do it. That's tough.
Yeah.
You had one small sponsor that was going to do everything, and then that sponsor was a big company. He started asking for all sorts of things, jumping through hoops, and I was really insulted by that. And you just said, no, you didn't say that. You just said, no, you did it on your own. Borrowed money, you rented equipment, and you came up north.
Yeah.
That's how you do it.
We learned so much of that from you, Will, because I think making a film is very much like any journey, and there's a lot of highs and there's a lot of lows and there's a lot of parts where you don't know where to go next on the route. And we would hear all these stories from you, Will, about planning Trans-Antarctica and all these other expeditions, and our mantra became, okay, if Will could cross Antarctica, we can tell a story about it. Great. Okay, question.
Yeah, can you speak a little bit about just the actual act of shooting in such extreme conditions? I know just dealing with, you mentioned before, like battery life, and how you get it all.
Yeah, that's a great question too. So we, again, like over preparing, we had backups of everything. Lots of batteries, and then batteries in the cold can die quickly, so really trying to be strategic of placement of batteries, keeping them in warm places, and then I think moisture was like a big thing, wouldn't you say, about just making sure, like a picture like this, we're surrounded in snow and everything's wet and you're soaking wet and you have all this gear with you. And so there's just a lot of work in terms of also with the pre-production of, how to keep everything really weatherproof as best as we can. And then a lot of learning as we went too. But yeah, I think again, like there's so many great resources for adventure filmmaking from, it really just varies on the adventure, but from solar chargers to thinking of weatherproofing your gear to all the underwater equipment you can use. There was just a lot, but also at the same time, also having to think through of having the backups, but keeping everything really minimal as we could since we were on the go a lot. Great. Awesome. Well, if anyone else has any other questions, I'll be sticking around so we can chat outside. And yeah, thank you all so much for coming. Yeah.